I always knew that silence had power. That in the right hands, stillness could be sharper than a scream. And on the morning before the board meeting, I felt that silence humming in my bones, a kind of prophetic tension. Like the hush before thunder splits the sky. It was James who walked into the room like a conquering hero. My presentation, my months of research, projections, data modeling, spilling from his mouth like it had always belonged to him. I sat at the far end of the mahogany table, my fingers folded gently in my lap, my expression unreadable. He didn't see me. Not really. That was always his first mistake. They never do. Men like him. He clicked through my slides with practiced charm, dressing my labor in his voice, letting the numbers do the dazzling. The board nodded, impressed. They clapped, even. It was all going so well. Until the last slide faded into white and the room turned toward me for questions. And I asked just one. One thing, James, I said, my voice calm. On slide 9, you referenced Q2 revenue growth based on the West Coast expansion strategy. What assumptions did you use for customer churn in that region? Silence. The kind that stretches. The kind that reveals. I watched his face change, the color drain like ink running in water. He stammered something about cross-regional trends, something about Midwest retention. But it was too late. I knew he'd stolen the deck, but not the mind that made it. And the board, sharp-eyed and suddenly curious, asked him to clarify. To provide the data sources. To walk them through the model. He couldn't. Because it wasn't his. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The next morning, he was gone. And I was called in. They said things like clarity and leadership potential. But I think what they really saw was what James never did. Me. There's something surreal about returning to the same room where you were once invisible, only to find the chairs have shifted in your favor. I sat at the head of the conference table now. The same table where James had stood, parroting my work like a borrowed suit. The irony didn't escape me, nor did the looks from others, some surprised, some impressed, some calculating. I recognized that look. The kind that says, we underestimated you. Let them. It's easier to move quietly when no one's watching. When HR delivered the news about James, a misalignment of values, a breach of internal policy, it came wrapped in formality, a sanitized version of events. But beneath the language, the truth pulsed strong and undeniable. He'd gambled on his charm and lost to my discipline. I walked back to my office that day, my heels tapping a steady rhythm on polished floors. Each step a small, satisfying drumbeat of reclamation. The air felt different, charged lighter. That afternoon, I found the original deck saved under a folder he hadn't bothered to rename. He had even left my notes in the speakers section, subtle reminders of just how little he understood the material he'd stolen. I didn't delete it. I printed it. Framed the last slide. Not for revenge, but as a marker. A moment. A reminder that I didn't have to shout to be heard. I just had to wait for the silence to do its work. Promotion brought more than a new title. It brought old colleagues knocking with congratulatory smiles, the same ones who once dismissed me in meetings, talked over my suggestions, credited others with my ideas. Their praise felt hollow, but I accepted it with grace. Because winning with dignity tastes better than retaliation. Because I knew they would remember this moment longer than I ever needed them to. It would be too simple to paint James as the villain alone. Truth is, betrayal never arrives alone. It travels in shadows, in complicity, in quiet rooms where people nod and say nothing. Before the theft, I remember the day I first shared my projections with him. It was during a late evening strategy session, long after the rest of the team had filtered out. My office lamp cast soft halos over spreadsheets, and I, perhaps too eager to be seen as a collaborator, revealed more than I should have. He listened intently, asking questions not because he wanted to understand, but because he was calculating. I mistook interest for investment. When you've spent years navigating corridors of polite exclusion, you learn to translate the micro-infractions, ideas repeated louder by someone else, Recognition delayed until it suits the narrative, promotions postponed with phrases like, "Not quite the right time." But James didn't repeat me louder. He swallowed the entire story. When I found out, it wasn't a confrontation, it was a quiet unraveling. Little clues. The phrasing in his email that mirrored mine too closely. The familiar graphs during a dry run presentation. And then the unmistakable confirmation, my private annotations, lifted word for word. I remember standing in the ladies' room afterward, staring at myself in the mirror. Not crying. Not angry. Just tired. Tired of pretending the rules were the same for everyone. Tired of watching men with half the insight win full recognition. That was the moment I decided I wouldn't fight him for it. I would let him present. Let him hang himself with the rope he'd stolen from my hands. People always reveal themselves when the stakes are high. I just made sure the stakes would be undeniable. Being overlooked becomes a skill, if you live with it long enough. A kind of camouflage. You learn to make yourself small without even realizing it, shoulders slightly hunched, voice measured just a decibel too soft, hands folded in a way that says, "Don't worry, I won't ask for much." They called it humility. I called it survival. I mastered the art of doing the work while someone else stood in the spotlight. I was the ghost in the machine, fixing the metrics, smoothing the pitch, proofing the documents before the board ever saw them. The scaffolding behind their success. They remembered the house, not the one who built it. In team meetings, James would defer to me with a smile, then take credit for the clarity I brought. "We thought this model was promising," he'd say. We. As if the hours of analysis and late-night revisions were something he'd weathered too. And I let him. Not because I was weak, but because I was watching. That's the thing they never understood. I was always watching. Not with resentment, but with precision. Calculating which cards to keep, which moves to store for later. My ambition wasn't loud. It didn't swagger. It walked barefoot through the maze, memorizing each turn. And then, when the time was right, it struck. That question I asked in the boardroom? I had rehearsed it for weeks. Not just the words, but the silence I'd hold afterward. The weight of the pause. The way I'd meet their eyes, not blinking, not bailing him out. He was drowning in a sea he didn't understand, and I had simply stepped back. And when they looked at me, really looked, for the first time, I didn't flinch. I just smiled. Because some victories aren't about applause. They're about being seen. The weekend after the promotion, I stood in front of my mirror, still in my apartment, still the same dim yellow light that always flickered when the radiator kicked in. But something in my reflection had shifted. Not my clothes, not my makeup. It was in the eyes. Clearer. Steadier. Not joy. Not even pride. Recognition. I saw myself. Not the girl trying to be palatable. Not the woman who edited herself down to be manageable. I saw the strategist, the survivor. The one who had endured being underestimated until it became her sharpest edge. I didn't tell anyone how I'd really orchestrated James's fall. They assumed it was accidental, that he'd simply gotten caught in a moment of unpreparedness. That's what they prefer to believe. The narrative of male incompetence is more comfortable than the truth of female precision. So I let them believe it. Because power doesn't always need to shout. I spent that weekend walking the city alone. I bought a cappuccino from the corner shop that always spelled my name wrong. I sat in the park and watched people live ordinary lives. I listened to music I hadn't played in years. I did nothing that was expected of me. And in those moments of quiet, I remembered something I hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. Not the kind they sell in glossy magazines or self-help seminars, but the real kind. The kind that comes when you no longer need validation to breathe fully. That Monday, I returned to the office not with vengeance, but with vision. The seat at the table wasn't a throne. It was a tool. And I intended to use it well. Power has a scent. It lingers in boardrooms and corner offices, clings to the leather of chairs, the polished wood of desks, the knowing glances passed between men who have long claimed this space as their own. I felt it the moment I walked into my new office. James's name had been scraped from the frosted glass just hours earlier. His lingering cologne still haunted the corners. I stood there, silently, letting the air settle. No grand announcement. No triumphant music swelling in the background. Just me, breathing in a room he thought he owned. It took a long time for that air to feel like mine. There's a strange loneliness in being the one who gets promoted after betrayal. People don't know how to treat you. Some offered congratulations too eagerly, like a shield against their own guilt for not speaking up. Others barely made eye contact, afraid I might remind them of what it costs to win with integrity. But the truth was, this wasn't about them. This was about the woman who had waited long enough. So I unpacked slowly. A small photograph of my grandmother, the one who taught me the value of being underestimated. A chipped ceramic mug from my college days, painted with a quote she once said to me, "They'll call you stubborn. You call it strategy." I filled the shelves with books, actual ones, because knowledge, not noise, had always been my foundation. Then I sat behind the desk, ran my fingers across its edge, and whispered to the silence, "We made it." Not because it was the end of the journey, but because it was the beginning of my authorship. I no longer wanted to be the ghost in someone else's story. I wanted to write mine on my terms. After the dust settled, the office became quieter, but not in the peaceful way. It was the hush of recalibration, of colleagues reassigning their loyalties like stocks being traded before market close. They'd smile more now, lean into conversations with me, insert my name into meetings like it had always belonged there. But I remembered who had looked through me, who had silenced me with polite laughter when I brought ideas to the table, who had once forwarded James's memo, my memo, with a note saying, "Now this is leadership." I didn't forget. But I didn't retaliate either. That's not how I work. Instead, I started building something quieter, stronger, a kind of alliance. I reached out to the others who had been sidelined, talked over, dismissed, especially the women. Especially the ones who'd learned to measure every word before speaking, who apologized before offering ideas. I knew them. I had been them. So I started inviting them to my office not as guests but as equals. We talked about strategy, not small talk. I asked what support they needed, what visibility meant to them where they'd been discouraged from leading. And I listened. Really listened. We didn't call it anything. We didn't need to. But the energy shifted. We began moving differently in meetings, backing each other's points, redirecting credit where it was due, asking the harder questions, not just of the data, but of the culture that let James steal without suspicion. Some called it coincidence. Others called it a new era. I called it correction. And every time someone said, "This team feels different now," I just smiled and nodded. Because change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks in quietly, holding the door open for others. With promotion came access to budgets, projections, the inner mechanics of the very machine that had once tried to run without me. I spent long nights poring over spreadsheets that told stories numbers often hide. Patterns of preference, disproportionate funding allocations, names that rose quickly and quietly through the ranks, always familiar, always connected. It was all there, in black and white. James hadn't been an anomaly. He was a symptom. The real rot was deeper, older. But I wasn't afraid of rot. I was trained to recognize it, to clean it out at the root. So I began making small adjustments. No flashy reforms. No public crusade. I simply redirected budgets toward talent that had been overlooked, underutilized. I created new development initiatives, one-on-one mentorships, anonymous idea submissions, rotational leadership programs. And I made sure the metrics of success didn't just reward volume, but value. It wasn't about being nice. It was about building something sustainable, something fair. It's strange how quickly people call you radical when you start treating others equitably. But I didn't flinch when the whispers came. She's changing too much. She's only promoting her own kind. She's too ambitious. As if ambition should be rationed. as if there wasn't enough success to go around. But I knew what I was doing. I wasn't pulling others up as charity, I was investing in the infrastructure we should have had all along. And as the results began to speak louder than the doubters, I found myself being invited to panels, asked for by name in strategic planning meetings, sought after for insight not just by peers, but by those above me. And still, I remembered. The silence. The shadows. The moment in the boardroom when one question changed everything. That memory anchored me not to bitterness, but to purpose. Because I hadn't come this far to recreate the same old cycle. I'd come to break it. I suppose part of me expected James would reach out. Not with contrition, exactly, but with something. An excuse. A half-hearted confession. A clumsy attempt to reclaim dignity from the wreckage he'd caused. But silence was his parting gift. No email. No call. No acknowledgement. And somehow, that was perfect. Because apologies aren't always the currency we need. Sometimes, all we want is to be seen clearly, at last, without distortion. And I had that now. Not just from the board or the leadership team, but from the people who mattered, the ones who used to second-guess their worth in rooms where their voices had never echoed. They saw me and, through me, began to see themselves differently too. Still, there were moments, late at night, staring out the window of my new office, when I wondered how James explained it to himself. If he told some revisionist version over drinks with old friends. If he blamed pressure, deadlines, the system. I hoped, somewhere deep, the truth haunted him. Not for revenge's sake, but because integrity should leave an imprint when it's been violated. Me? I didn't need revenge. I had relevance. I had reach. But more importantly, I had peace. And that peace didn't come from the promotion. It came from knowing I had stayed silent not out of fear, but choice. That I had trusted the quiet strategy that had never failed me before. Let others chase apologies. I'd rather chase legacy. You start to hear things, once you're in a position they thought you'd never reach. Whispers. Not the sharp, cutting kind, but the speculative ones. The office has its own version of folklore, and I became one of its myths. She waited him out. She played the long game. She knew exactly what she was doing. And they were right. But not in the way they thought. It wasn't a game. It was survival. It was years of taking the stairs while others rode elevators made of nepotism and charm. It was nodding through meetings where my ideas returned to me with someone else's name attached. It was pretending not to notice the glances when I spoke, or the way my emails became group decisions. Now those same people sent their new hires to my office for mentorship. Now they quoted me. Now they waited for my approval like it was oxygen. Funny how perception shifts when your signature can alter someone's path. I didn't let it go to my head. That's not what this was ever about. But I did let it sink in. That the woman they once ignored had become the standard. That I'd built my credibility not on performance alone, but on restraint. On not burning the building when I had every reason to. And when new women joined our team, women with cautious eyes and careful posture, I saw echoes of myself in them. I made sure their voices didn't just echo in empty rooms. I made sure they thundered. The glass ceiling? It hadn't shattered that day in the boardroom. No, it cracked a little each time I told the truth with my work. Each time I said less and proved more. Each time I chose grace over retaliation. And now the echo chamber was mine. Not to fill with noise, but with change. The truth is, I still carry her with me, the woman I was before the storm. The one who used to second-guess every word in an email draft. Who double-checked her tone, her commas, her courage. Who asked for permission when she should have been given a seat. She visits sometimes, late at night when the building is empty and the silence feels familiar again. She sits with me, that version of myself. The invisible one. The one who whispered her ideas to herself first, just to test if they were worthy of being spoken aloud. I don't hate her. I honor her. She is the one who got me here. Because even when the world treated her like a footnote, she kept writing the story. Every late night. Every uncredited idea. Every moment she said, "Yes, I can help," when she should have said, "This is mine." She endured. And that endurance became my inheritance. It's not fashionable to talk about the cost of making it. People love the highlight reel, the triumphant promotion, the poetic justice. But they rarely ask what it cost to stand upright when the world was pushing you down with smiles and policies and praise for someone else. It costs something. It always does. But I paid in silence, in patience, in knowing. And now I repay that debt forward every time I see someone like her in the halls. Someone doing the work, waiting for their chance to ask just one question. I see her. And I make sure others do too. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't take the mic. It's pass it to someone who's never been handed one. Authority isn't about volume. It's not in the clipped commands, the power suits, or the forced laughter at boardroom jokes. It's in presence. The way a room recalibrates when you speak with calm certainty. The way eyes turn toward you, not because you demand it, but because they trust what comes next. I had to build that presence. Brick by brick. Not with noise, but with consistency, reliability, precision. In the weeks after my promotion, I made it a point to walk the floor without entourage, to ask real questions and wait for real answers. I memorized names, not titles. Noticed who stayed late, who made things work without recognition. And I remembered. I remembered what it felt like to be seen only when convenient. To have your worth calculated by your proximity to power instead of the integrity of your work. So I did the opposite. I elevated the quiet performers. I built a team based not on legacy, but capability. We didn't become louder. We became undeniable. And that changed everything. Project deadlines started hitting early. Morale ticked up without the need for pizza parties or empty incentives. People spoke more freely in meetings, knowing they wouldn't be dismissed. Innovation wasn't just a buzzword, it became a practice because safety had been restored. That's the part they forget when they talk about leadership. That real authority is earned not through fear or politics, but through trust. And trust, like anything valuable, takes time to build and a heartbeat to destroy. I didn't wield my authority like a sword. I used it like a compass, to point us somewhere better. It happens slowly at first. Subtly, the tone of emails starts to shift. Where once there were abrupt requests, now there are soft greetings. Hope you're well. Just wanted to check in. People who once overlooked you now loop you in early. Their language becomes deferential, measured. Suddenly, you're not just a name at the bottom of a reply thread. You're the thread itself. The first to be copied, the last to be questioned. I noticed it one Monday morning, subject line, strategy consultation, your insight needed. Not would you like to join? Not per your previous work. Just, your insight needed. For words that meant everything. But I didn't respond immediately. I had learned the value of space. Letting silence draw the shape of my importance. I no longer scrambled to prove I belonged. I knew. Still, the shift brought with it something bittersweet. Because woven into that recognition was the quiet knowledge of what it took to get here. That the world only listens once you've survived enough not to need their validation anymore. I thought about younger me, the one who used to reread her own drafts 3 times before pressing send. The one who deleted strong sentences because she worried they'd be read as arrogant. She wouldn't recognize this version of us. But I think she'd be proud. Not of the title. Not of the access. But of the unshakable self we'd finally become. And every time a new message appeared, asking for advice, for vision, for clarity, I answered with the quiet confidence of someone who had once been voiceless. Because power, when rooted in integrity, grows louder even in silence. There's a strange kind of amnesia that settles over a workplace after someone like James disappears. As if the story rewrites itself overnight. As if people suddenly forget how complicit they were in propping up his version of events. Those who once praised his leadership now shook their heads solemnly when his name came up. It's a shame what happened. He always seemed a little off. We were just waiting for someone to say something. But they hadn't waited. They'd benefited from his charm, his shortcuts, his talent for delegating brilliance while keeping the spotlight. And when he fell, they simply pivoted. No acknowledgement. No apology. No reckoning. At first, that used to ache. I'd walk the halls, smile politely, nod at those who had once side-eyed my success. Those who dismissed my concerns, my voice, my presence. I'd wanted someone, just one person, to say it. We were wrong. But they never did. And maybe that silence was a confession in itself. So I stopped waiting. Because I realized apologies are not the finish line. The finish line is when you no longer require them to feel whole. When you can look at the very people who tried to erase you and feel nothing but clarity. They didn't see me then. But I see myself now. And that is more powerful than any belated remorse. So I let their silence hang. Not as a wound, but as a monument to how far I've come without them. I keep 3 things in the top drawer of my desk. Not files. Not policies. Not the latest corporate strategy memo. Memories. One is a photo. A snapshot from a time when I still thought hard work alone would be enough. I'm smiling wide-eyed, holding a coffee in one hand and a notepad in the other, ready to lead a team that would never give me credit. The second is a folded slip of paper, James's meeting agenda from that infamous board presentation. His name printed at the top in bold. My words underneath in smaller font, unacknowledged. I kept it not as a grudge, but as a reminder of the lines I'll never let anyone cross again. The third is a letter I wrote to myself, but never sent. It begins, "Dear you, the one who stays late and leaves quietly." And it ends, "One day, they will ask how you did it. You'll say, I kept showing up even when they didn't." That drawer isn't sacred, but it is personal. A place I return to in quiet moments, not for reassurance, but for grounding. Because when success finally arrives, it's easy to forget the terrain you crawled over to claim it. But I don't want to forget. I want to remember the woman who sat in cubicles and watched others speak her thoughts aloud. Who smiled while swallowing disappointment? Who made magic out of invisibility? That woman built this. And every time I open that drawer, I nod to her. She didn't need permission. She needed only a plan and time. When the executive retreat invitations were sent out this year, I didn't expect mine. Not because I wasn't qualified. Not because I hadn't earned it. But because I remembered the last time, 2 years ago, when James received his embossed envelope and I received silence. I had watched him from across the open floor as he chuckled with the others, tucking the sleek, white card into his breast pocket like a badge of inevitability. I remember the look he gave me, a blend of pity and smugness. Next time, he'd said, as if he held the door. But this time, the envelope had my name etched in gold. Not just a guest, but a keynote. I stared at it for a long time, fingers tracing the calligraphy, remembering all the ways I'd once begged for inclusion without ever speaking the words aloud. All the times I thought, if I just work harder, if I just wait longer. But inclusion isn't earned through silence. It's forged in resistance. When I walked into the retreat, I didn't bring a pitch. I brought presence. The kind you cultivate over years of being ignored and still delivering excellence. The kind that doesn't need validation, only opportunity. And when I spoke on leadership, on integrity, on silent sabotage, on what it means to lead when the room isn't made for you, I saw eyes widen. Heads nod. I saw recognition blooming in faces that once couldn't meet my gaze. Afterward, one of the senior partners approached me. "We should have had you speak years ago," he said. I smiled politely. I was always here. And I had been. Even when they didn't look. Even when they looked straight through. Now, they listened. Not because I was louder, but because the truth had grown undeniable. There's a peculiar sound that lives in memory, applause meant for someone else, rising in a room where your words had just been spoken by another. I used to sit at the back of the room, pretending to take notes as James echoed my insights, polished with confidence and delivered without credit. And when the clapping began, I would nod along, smile dutifully, pretend the applause didn't sting. Pretend I didn't notice. But I always noticed. There's no manual for what to do in those moments. No HR protocol for the kind of theft that leaves no fingerprints, only the ache of being passed over. So I learned to channel it, to turn that ache into fuel. And now, when they clap for me, it's different. Not louder, necessarily, but earned, not borrowed. There's no sting, only clarity. A deep inhale, a grounded presence. Still, when the applause ends and people rush forward with handshakes and praise, I remember those earlier rooms. I remember how I swallowed disappointment like glass and built something from the shards. They never saw the applause that didn't happen. But I did. And in a way, I think it shaped me more than any ovation ever could. Because it taught me not to seek validation from echoes, but to build my own sound. One not dependent on who's listening, but on who can no longer ignore. There's a simple test in every office that reveals more than any review or performance metric, where people sit at lunch. When I was invisible, I sat alone. Not out of choice, but because my presence didn't make sense to their conversations. I wasn't part of the laughter, the leaning in, the low-voiced office gossip passed like currency over sandwiches and half-finished salads. James always sat in the center. The kind of magnetic, performative space where confidence was confused with competence. He commanded attention with stories I knew were stitched with exaggeration, sometimes even lifted directly from my own experience. And I let it happen then. But now, things had changed. I noticed it first when 2 newer associates asked if they could join me. Then 3. Then more. Not to network. Not to impress. Just to listen, to learn, to belong. And I made room. Because I remembered what it felt like to scan a cafeteria and find no table that welcomed you. I remembered the forced small talk, the polite nods that never turned into invitations. I remembered how absence becomes habit, and how loneliness can echo even in crowded spaces. So I made my table long. I brought chairs where there were none. Asked names. Remembered birthdays. Shared space without hierarchy. Not because I wanted to be liked, but because I wanted no one to feel what I had felt. Power doesn't just live in offices and titles. It lives in who we invite to sit beside us. And I had waited long enough to know. I would not become the person who closed her circle once she finally stood at its center. It was a Tuesday morning when she knocked, softly, on my office door. An intern, barely 20, with nervous eyes and a clipboard hugged to her chest like armor. I just wanted to say, "I've been watching how you handle meetings," she said, voice faltering. "You don't interrupt people. You ask the quiet ones what they think. You let silence hang sometimes, and it makes the whole room pay attention." I smiled, surprised. Not because it wasn't true, but because she had seen it. Really seen it. Sometimes you forget that while you're navigating firestorms and ceilings made of glass, someone is watching, not to judge, but to learn. And she had been. I used to think I had to talk fast to seem smart, she admitted. But watching you taught me something else, that presence doesn't rush. I invited her in, and we talked for 10 minutes. That's all it took. But when she left, I sat with her words. Because that's the part of the story no one glamorizes. Not the fallout, not the promotion, not the poetic justice, but the quiet legacy you leave behind, person by person, moment by moment. I had spent so long surviving the architecture of power that I didn't always stop to see how I was redesigning it as I climbed. But she saw it, and that was enough to remind me. Leadership isn't who's in front. It's who turns around and makes sure others don't have to walk alone. It started with a quarterly report, dry on the surface, like most data sheets tend to be. But within the columns, I saw something else, a subtle but measurable shift. Employee retention had improved. Team satisfaction metrics were climbing. And the most telling line? Project output was not just meeting expectations, it was exceeding them. All without the usual churn of egos and performance theater that had once defined our floor. No grand announcements. No leadership overhauls. Just the ripple effect of quieter power, of decisions made with care, of voices lifted not in defiance, but in design. I forwarded the report to senior leadership, attaching only one sentence. Let's talk about what happens when the right people are finally heard. A few hours later, I received a call from the COO. Not to discuss numbers, but to ask how I did it. How, in the aftermath of disruption, a team once defined by tension had become the model for cohesion. And I told the truth. We stopped rewarding noise. We started rewarding nuance. We stopped asking who could speak best and started listening to who had been silent longest. He was quiet for a long moment before he said, "We should replicate this across other divisions." I nodded, already knowing we wouldn't replicate this, not fully, because what we built wasn't a strategy. It was a culture. And culture doesn't scale unless the people at the top believe in its worth. But I agreed to help under one condition. That we start by listening. Not evaluating. Not assuming. Listening. Because the numbers had already told the story. It was time to let the people do the same. They changed the room. That was the first thing I noticed when I entered the new Leadership Strategy Summit. No more long tables with chairs stacked like ladders of power. No front. No end. Just a circle. It was subtle, but meaningful. And I wondered, as I took my seat, if maybe, just maybe, something I'd done had helped inspire it. The room filled slowly with department heads, regional directors, and the kind of quiet, capable leaders who rarely fought to be heard, but had survived long enough to be followed. I glanced across the circle and saw eyes meet mine without challenge, without dismissal. Just a quiet nod, a recognition. When the CEO opened the session, he didn't start with projections. He asked a question. What's working? Not what's broken. Not who's underperforming. But what's working? The shift was tectonic. And as the conversation moved, I noticed how different it felt. Ideas didn't compete, they built. Voices didn't rise to dominate, they harmonized. No one was rushing. No one needed to be the smartest in the room. Because we'd all learned, sometimes painfully, that the smartest person in the room is the one who knows when to listen. When it was my turn, I didn't launch into a pitch. I didn't reference James, or the theft, or the fire that forged me. I said, we need to stop managing perception and start managing purpose. People are smarter than we give them credit for. They can feel when leadership is posturing. They can feel when we are lying. And they can feel when someone is genuinely trying to build something that lasts. Silence followed, but not the kind that burns, the kind that soaks in. And then someone across the table said, I've been waiting for someone to say that. And just like that, the circle did what it was meant to do. It turned. They threw a celebration in my honor, something about record growth, retention gains, and exceptional transformation leadership. There were speeches prepared, pastries ordered, even a photo booth with branded props. All the trappings of a moment meant to be memorable. I didn't go. Not because I wasn't grateful, but because I'd already celebrated, in my own way, weeks before, on a quiet Sunday afternoon. I had walked the city alone, coat tucked close against the wind. No destination, just movement. The kind that reminds you that progress isn't always about upward motion. Sometimes, it's the forward breath of solitude. The kind you take when you're no longer carrying the weight of being unseen. That was my celebration. Not applause in the break room, but a long exhale, a hand on my own shoulder. A whispered, you did it. You didn't become what they tried to make you. So when they asked later where I had been, I smiled and said, just catching up with myself. Because no one tells you that sometimes, the most sacred victory isn't in being honored by the people who once overlooked you. It's in no longer needing their recognition to validate your presence. I sent a thank you note to the team who organized it. Personal, handwritten. No grand gestures, just the kind of detail I knew they'd notice. Because leadership isn't about accepting crowns. It's about choosing when to step aside and let others shine. And on that day, I chose not to center myself. Because I already knew who I was. And that was enough. Sometimes, the hardest part isn't what you endure. It's what you witness. I watched many before me, women and men both, quietly carry the weight of being unrecognized. I watched their faces in meetings when their ideas were dismissed, only to be resurrected minutes later by louder voices. I saw the flicker of pride fade into resignation. I saw brilliance dim under fluorescent lights that only illuminated the favored. And worst of all, I saw them adapt. They learned to shrink, to nod when interrupted, to soften their opinions so they wouldn't sound threatening, to take notes instead of credit, to mentor others while watching those men's leapfrog them in promotions. And yet, they stayed. Because some of us don't have the luxury of leaving. Because we are told over and over, be patient. Your time will come. But patience in these halls was too often code for obedience. I refused to forget their faces as I rose. Each promotion, each strategy win, each public praise carried the echoes of those who never received theirs. And I promised myself, this seat I earned wouldn't just serve me. It would serve them. And those who came after. Because I knew what they knew, that even when you stay silent, you never stop feeling the injustice. It lives under your skin. It sharpens your instincts. It teaches you to read a room in ways others never learn. That skill, the one they call intuition, was survival. And now it was my compass. Whenever I sat in meetings with fresh voices, especially those whose confidence wavered in the presence of power, I saw it. The flicker. And I spoke up. I redirected credit. I invited clarification when someone was interrupted. I paused to allow the hesitant ones to complete their thought. And sometimes I saw the flicker catch, turn into flame. That, I realized, was the real victory. Not that I had climbed, but that I could now study the ladder for others who had been watching just as I once did. Because if we're forced to learn in the shadows, then let us become architects of light. Power keeps its own kind of books. Not the ledgers of revenue or profit margins, but a quiet, invisible accounting of who was heard, who was dismissed, who was lifted, and who was stolen from. For years, I lived in the red column of that invisible ledger. And as I settled fully into my role, I finally understood. This unspoken accounting exists in every organization, every institution. No matter how progressive the company claims to be, no matter how many posters hang on the walls about diversity, equity, and inclusion, the real ledger lives in people's memories. Mine was long. I remembered the managers who told me I was too assertive when I challenged an analysis. The colleagues who interrupted me, only to later repeat my conclusions as if they'd thought of them first. The executives who praised my thoroughness but handed promotions to those with louder laughter at the company parties. And, of course, James. James, who wrote himself into my chapter without permission, certain that charm was a sufficient substitute for substance. He hadn't expected me to do what I did. They never expect the quiet ones to know when to strike. The difference between us was never intelligence. It was discipline, patience, endurance. And now, sitting where he once sat, I could finally see how precarious his kind of power had always been. Power built on borrowed brilliance is fragile. It cracks the moment you ask the wrong question in front of the right people. I had built differently, brick by brick, with hands that knew both creation and restraint. But with my promotion came a new responsibility to confront that invisible ledger and decide what to do with it. It would have been easy to settle scores, to quietly edge out those who once ignored me, to repay silence with silence. But that was not the leadership I wanted to model. The trap of oppression is how easily it seduces you into recreating it once you gain control. No. I wanted to balance the ledger not through punishment, but through correction. So, I began reviewing promotion slates personally. I looked beyond the rehearsed self-promoters and asked deeper questions. Who actually delivered? Who supported others? Whose work was being quietly claimed by louder voices? I listened differently now. And slowly, names began rising who had previously been invisible. I created sponsorship programs for those who had never been invited into leadership training. Not mentorship, sponsorship. There's a difference. Mentorship offers advice. Sponsorship offers access. My career nearly withered for lack of the latter. I met with each of them personally. I wanted them to know this wasn't charity. It was recognition long overdue. You don't owe me gratitude, I told them. You owe yourself preparation. I saw in their eyes the same mixture of hope and skepticism I once carried. It's hard to trust open doors when you've spent years knocking and hearing nothing. But I would keep those doors open, even if they hesitated to walk through at first. Meanwhile, some of my peers, those who had once dismissed me, began to grow uneasy. They couched their discomfort in polite language. Are we moving too quickly? Are these candidates ready? Are we diluting standards? The familiar dog whistles of threatened privilege. I answered each concern with data, with results, with the steady voice they now could not afford to challenge. Our standards remain high, I said in one particularly tense leadership meeting. We're simply widening the lens of who gets seen. And as the promoted candidates excelled, their performance silenced the critics far more effectively than any argument ever could. I did not raise my voice. I let their excellence speak. Because in the end, I knew this truth. The most radical thing you can do is insist on fairness in a system built on exceptions. As months passed, I noticed how the organization began to shift. Not loudly, not in sweeping declarations, but in small, meaningful ways. Meetings with more diverse voices at the table. Projects that reflected a richer variety of ideas. Junior staff speaking with a confidence that had been absent before. Even the office chatter changed. Less of the old insider jokes. More curiosity. More collaboration. It was working. But I never allowed myself to forget how fragile progress can be. The moment you stop tending to it, the old ledger begins writing itself again. One day, walking through the lobby, I passed by a framed photo from years ago, one of the leadership team when I first joined. All suits. All men. All smiles. I paused for a moment, studying their faces. Most of them were gone now, retired, moved, or quietly exited as the company's culture evolved past their comfort. I didn't feel triumph. I felt relief. Not because I had won, but because we had finally stopped pretending their way was the only way. The building remembers. Not in the way people do, not in gossip or in whispered stories passed between cubicles, but in its walls, its rooms, its rituals. The building had witnessed my entire ascent. Every late night I stayed when others had long gone home. Every presentation rehearsal whispered into empty air. Every quiet recalibration after yet another stolen idea. The building had seen it all. Even now, when I walked its familiar corridors, the ghosts of my earlier self accompanied me not as burdens, but as markers. Reminders of where I had stood when James first began lifting my work. Of the exact elevator ride where a senior manager once said, "You're very competent for your age." Of the empty conference room where I had sat rehearsing the question that would eventually expose him. Now others filled those spaces, new hires, younger faces, voices that hadn't yet learned to flinch at being interrupted. And I watched them carefully. Because part of power is knowing when you're being watched and knowing how to ensure those who watch you see something worth modeling. In my meetings, I never interrupted the nervous junior analyst struggling to find her words. I let her stumble, catch herself, and finish. I nodded encouragement without speaking, and when she finally landed her point, I amplified it. Excellent insight, let's explore that. Simple gestures, but I knew their weight. Because I remembered how it felt when no one offered them to me. I had also begun hosting monthly, quiet roundtables. No formal agenda, no hierarchy, just space for those usually talked over to speak freely. At first, people attended cautiously, unsure if it was a trap disguised as inclusion. But word spread quickly. Here, people listened. The roundtables became powerful in ways I hadn't anticipated. Complex problems surfaced. Innovative solutions emerged. And people who had been typecast as support staff offered ideas that reshaped entire processes. The very voices once ignored became our competitive advantage. But not everyone was comfortable with this evolution. There were the silent resistors, the ones who would nod in meetings, only to undermine later in closed-door conversations. They clung to the old ledger, hoping the system might still return to what they once ruled. I let them maneuver, because I knew the math was no longer on their side. The data spoke too clearly: retention up, productivity up, client satisfaction at record levels. Every metric they once used to justify exclusion now justified inclusion. Even so, I remained vigilant, because fragility hides itself best in moments of progress. One evening, I stayed late, the building nearly empty, reviewing succession plans. A quiet knock at my door startled me. It was Sophia, one of the younger managers I had quietly sponsored over the past year. "Can I ask you something?" she said, hesitating at the doorway. "Of course," I said, waving her in. She closed the door behind her, a gesture that told me this wasn't a casual question. "How do you stay steady?" she asked. "When you know some people are still waiting for you to fail?" I studied her for a moment. She was bright, capable, and seeing clearly now what it meant to be visible as a woman in power. "They don't want me to fail anymore," I said softly. "Now, they want me to surrender." She frowned, unsure. "They want me to compromise just enough that the old system can survive inside the new one. To soften. To be grateful and quiet now that I have a seat." Sophia's eyes widened. She understood. "And will you?" I smiled. "No," I said. "Because we're not here just to sit. We're here to redesign the table." Sophia exhaled and nodded. The weight of generations settled between us, unspoken but understood. That was the real work. Not simply surviving what James had done, but ensuring no one could ever do it again. Power attracts propositions. Not always explicit. Sometimes it arrives in the form of opportunities, wrapped in silk words that sound like progress, but smell faintly of compromise. And eventually, one came for me. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the email arrived, subject line simple, almost benign: future opportunities. But the name attached to it made me pause. A global consultancy. One of the major firms. The kind that once wouldn't have looked twice at me, let alone sought me out. They were expanding, they said. They admired my transformational leadership. They had followed my recent metrics, my cultural redesign. They wanted to discuss next-level executive positioning. The subtext was clear: we see you now. And, for the first time in years, I felt the familiar tug. The one that whispers, "They want you. You've arrived." They offered a salary that eclipsed my current compensation. Equity packages. Global reach. Prestige. Everything that, once, would have seemed like the pinnacle. But as I read, a quiet steadiness settled in me. Because I saw the ledger again. Not theirs, mine. I remembered the faces of my team, the young analyst who now spoke with confidence, the former intern who had risen through sponsorship, the women and men who had begun to believe that this place, this company, once so dismissive, could be different. And I understood, in that moment, something James never did. Power isn't in the seat. It's in the shadow you cast once you sit down. If I left now, the old system might quietly reclaim what it had lost. My absence would be framed as ambition, as natural attrition. The old guard would whisper, "See? She was never really committed." And those coming behind me would hear those whispers and feel the weight of doubt again. No, not yet. I declined the offer politely, firmly. "This work isn't finished," I wrote. Because while they offered me influence, I already had something rarer: impact. Afterwards, I sat for a long time, watching the city lights flicker outside my window. James would have taken that offer. He would have seized the title, the optics, the applause. But I wasn't him. My ascent had been built not on quick wins, but on patient, deliberate disruption. That kind of leadership doesn't chase the next bigger room. It makes the room you're in bigger for others. A year after I declined the offer, something happened I hadn't fully anticipated. They asked me to mentor him. Not James, he was long gone, his name barely whispered now except in cautionary tales. No, this was a younger version. A new rising star. Ambitious. Polished. Brilliant on paper. He had been fast-tracked by upper management, already speaking on panels, presenting with confidence that felt eerily familiar. And yet, I saw it immediately. He had never been tested. He had been praised early, protected often, promoted quickly. His ascent had been built not entirely on theft like James, but on something more dangerous, unchecked ease. I was called into a closed-door conversation with the board. "We'd like you to help refine his leadership approach," one of the senior members said. "He's good, but rough around the edges. We think your guidance could shape him." Shape him. The irony wasn't lost on me. I nodded, agreeing to the request, not because I wanted to, but because I understood the unspoken message behind it. You have influence now. Use it. Our first meeting was cordial. He arrived 10 minutes late, apologized smoothly, and immediately launched into his goals, his vision, his big picture thinking. I listened. When he finally paused, I asked one simple question. "Tell me who made space for you." He blinked. Confused. "I mean the people who carried water so you could run this far without stumbling. Who protected you. Who absorbed the blame when you erred. Who taught you before you were ready." He struggled for a moment, then said, "Well, I've worked hard, of course." I smiled, not unkindly. I had heard this tone before. It was the voice of those who believed their own myth. "No one rises alone," I said softly. "Not truly. And if you don't learn to see who steadied you, you'll never be able to steady anyone else." Over the next weeks, we met regularly. Slowly, I chipped at the edges. I introduced him to projects he couldn't easily solve. Put him into teams where he was no longer the loudest voice. Assigned him sponsors from outside his usual circle, people who didn't flatter him, but challenged him. And I watched as, piece by piece, the scaffolding around his untested confidence began to crack, not to break him, but to rebuild him. Because real leadership isn't built in applause. It's built in discomfort. In listening. In learning what you don't know. Months later, during one of our final sessions, he surprised me. "I used to think being the smartest person in the room was the goal," he admitted quietly. "Now I understand it's about making sure no one leaves the room unheard." I nodded. That's the beginning of leadership. As he left that day, I sat in my office for a long time afterward, absorbing what had just happened. Because what I realized then was something even deeper. The ultimate vindication isn't watching your enemies fall. It's breaking the cycle. Not recreating what was done to you, but using what you endured to create something better. I had once dreamed of justice. But now I understood. Justice is temporary. Legacy is permanent. And this, mentoring him, was part of mine.